Good morning. I looked at myself in the mirror this morning after I got ready, and I realized I look like I'm competing in a Buddy Holly lookalike competition. I think I'm winning, though. I don't know. This morning, we're going to talk about one of the most famous stories in the Bible. And the title for this lesson is Faith in the Face of Fear and Trembling, or Faith in Fear and Trembling. And those aren't fun words. Who gets excited when they hear fear and trembling? Isn't that everyone's favorite thing to feel? Yeah, absolutely not. And this comes, of course, from Philippians 2:12. It's funny because such a happy book has such a somber message mixed in it. I want you to listen here. Paul says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." Does he say, I'm going to work out your salvation with fear and trembling? Who's this charged to? Them as individuals. To us as individuals, it's incumbent upon us in our Christian walk that we analyze, not that we play any part in attributing or meriting salvation, right? Nothing like that. But to understand the process of salvation, the process of sanctification, to make sure that we're keeping in step with the Spirit absolutely is a thing that we must consider with fear and trembling. And this is a thing that no one else can do for us. No, your parent, your spouse, your kids, they can't take this job from you. This is something that every Christian must go through. You and you alone are going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, right? It's just you. No one else there with you. You stand alone. So it's all the more imperative that you understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and who you have faith in, and why you're living, and how you conduct your life, right? That's working out your own salvation. But how do we do this? How do we work out our own salvation? And the answer throughout Scripture is faith, that you have faith in God. And faith is the engine to the car, right? If your engine's messed up, will it help if you get an oil change in your car? No. What if you get it decaled, right? What if you put new windows in it, you change the transmission? Will any of that do any good if you have a bad engine? No. Same with Christianity. If you have all the doctrine and everything in the right order and you've done all the right steps, but there's no faith in any of that doctrine and any of that walk with Christ, it's your broke down car. Because faith is a requirement to be a child of God, to be a follower of God. It's what distinguishes us from the world. But when we think of fear and trembling, that's a weighty thing to consider, right? If nothing else, you know this is important and requires that I analyze it somberly, right? That this is a big deal. If I'm doing it with fear and trembling, it means it's a big deal. So today I want to discuss the importance of faith in the face of fear and trembling when we are terrified. And I read a book that heavily inspired this sermon called Fear and Trembling by a fellow named Søren Kierkegaard. Lived in the 1800s. He was a Danish theologian and philosopher. Not very important, but the insight is very fascinating because he lived in a culture that was mainly religious. Almost all of his neighbors, all his coworkers, they all went to church. They would all proclaim that they were Christians. And yet he looked out and he didn't really see anyone who was living a life of faith, or a life that was anything outside of comfortable, right? Because it's easy to follow God when everyone else does it, and when it doesn't challenge your rationality, your morality, or when it's completely comfortable, right? It's not hard to follow God when, for example, when I heard when I was a kid, 10 Commandments, right? Do not steal. That's just not my thing. I have never had a problem with stealing. So it's easy for me to follow God with the not stealing because I've never really wanted to, right? But then, of course, there's other things that are tempting. But Kierkegaard wished to challenge society's perception of faith through the lens of the Abraham and Isaac narrative. And I think it's important because we live, here specifically in Mount Sterling, it's a mainly religious society, I'd say. Most people that I've met in the city go to a church of some kind, right? But church or just being religious, that's not what faith is. And so what I'd like to do this morning is go through a thought experiment with this story. And I want you the whole time as we're analyzing it, put yourself in Abraham's sandals. Think about what you would do, how you would respond. And I hope that you start to realize you have a lot to work on. Because as I've analyzed this, I've realized I have a lot to work on. And we become content sometimes in our Christian walk, and we fail to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Instead, we go in cruise control, and we just breeze through that. But let's stop and truly challenge our minds and our thinking. In Genesis 22:1, again, famous, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, within that burnt offering, I'll have you know, they didn't just burn the animal alive as a sacrifice. So you understand the implication of this. He's supposed to kill his child and burn him on an altar before God. And we know what Abraham did. So Abraham rose early in the morning. That's not an accident. Early in the morning, saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. So here's the thought experiment. We're going to go through different scenarios of how could have Abraham responded to this. We have the way he did respond, but Scripture, especially in the Old Testament and especially in Genesis, is filled with meditation literature, which means you're supposed to read these stories and then just chew on it. You just think about it. You analyze it. And so we're going to do that this morning. We're going to eat this story. We're going to analyze it. So let's ask the first question. What if Abraham got this command from God, Abraham, kill your child? If Abraham was rational, how would he respond? Well, is it rational to kill your own child when that's your only child who's going to propagate your name? That's not very rational. And so in this case, it's not rational in a worldly sense to obey God, right? Because does everyone agree, killing your own kid is not a rational thing to do? Everyone agree? Okay, good. Yeah, it's not a very rational thing to do. So let's ask this question. What if Abraham was an ethical person? An ethical, right? And what I mean by that is a lot of people that we work with or that we see that we know are generally decent people, right? They're usually pretty ethical people. Not that they're perfect, but they don't cheat on their taxes. They don't cheat on their spouse. They try not to lie, right? All these things that are ethical, societal norms that we all agree these are good things. Well, it is morally reprehensible to kill your own child. Does everyone agree with that? What if if Stan said, hey, I killed Clay this morning because God told me to? How would we all respond to Stan? We'd call the police. You lost your mind. You killed your own child. What do you mean? That didn't happen. That's not an ethical thing to do, to kill your own child. Again, I think no one would disagree with that. It's unethical to kill your own child. So this command from God, therefore, is immoral. So he could choose to do the ethical thing, this worldly ethical thing to do, and disobey God, because it's not ethical to kill your own child. But those were all not considering the God aspect of it. But Abraham was religious. So in this case, he could forget about what was rational or ethical because God's will is the highest good, right? That means I'm resigning what I think is moral. I'm resigning what to me is logical, and I'm choosing God's way because God knows best and God is good. Therefore, the highest good is to obey God and do this thing that to me seems morally reprehensible and irrational, right? Because this is the child that's been promised over and over. This doesn't make any sense. It doesn't seem moral to kill my own child, yet God commanded it. Therefore, I'll obey it because God is the highest good. So here's the options, because with obeying God, there's a few. So full obedience with fear and trembling. So what if Abraham responded with full obedience with fear and trembling? So if he responded like this, it would be a movement of faith, right? Because he obeys, does something that's terrible to him. That's the fear and trembling, because he's afraid of what he's going to do because of his obedience and loyalty to God. But this obedience would come at a cost. And I think we can break it up into different stages. Again, this is the aspect of the book that, again, this is hypothetical, but it's for us to meditate on, to chew on. So it would entail initial submission, which means Abraham would have acknowledged God's command to kill his own child and accepted it as a divine imperative. God told me to do this, I'm doing it. He would understand the gravity of the situation and the need to follow God's will. But it would be followed with profound fear and trembling. Throughout the process, Abraham would experience a deep sense of fear and trembling in his heart. He would be acutely aware of the ethical and emotional weight of the command to sacrifice his son. Right? I'm going to obey God, but do you think he's leaping in his heart? Like, oh boy, I get to kill my child. Do you think that'd be going on with full obedience? With fear and trembling? Absolutely not. Maybe there'd be preparation and prayer. Abraham might engage in a period of intense prayer and spiritual preparation, seeking God's guidance and strength to carry through with the command. His prayers could be marked by inner conflict, questioning, and a genuine struggle to reconcile his love for Isaac with his devotion to God. Remember, because God says, your only son whom you love. So you asked away, the love of my son or the love of God? And that'd be, can you imagine those prayers if you responded like this? So communication with Isaac, right? What would he say to Isaac in this case? Well, Abraham may have felt compelled to communicate with Isaac, explaining the situation to him to the extent possible. This conversation could be emotional, as he would likely express his love and sorrow while emphasizing the importance of obeying God. And what's fascinating is, in the account, he doesn't communicate the plans to Isaac, does he? Which is a signal for something. So, but in this scenario, he might have. And so this would lead to the completion of the act with trembling. So when the time came to carry out the sacrifice, Abraham would proceed with the act as commanded by God. However, his obedience would be marked by profound trembling and emotional turmoil. He might even weep or express his anguish during the process. Right? Can you imagine just his hands shaking and crying out to God and screaming for the pain that he's about to inflict on his son? And this might lead to a profound spiritual crisis. So after the act, Abraham would likely enter into a profound spiritual crisis. Why on earth did God make me do that? Why on earth did God put me through that whole ordeal? What was the purpose of it? He might question the nature of God's command and wrestle with the ethical implications of his actions. You know, he may wonder, why was that ethical for me to do that? Because that seems so morally reprehensible to kill my own child. This crisis could continue for an extended period as he sought understanding and reconciliation with his faith and morality. Like maybe he would obey, but then for his whole life go wondering, why on earth would God put me in that situation? Why on earth would God allow me to be tested like that? And maybe there's moments in your life where you feel like that. Why on earth would God allow me to go through that? Why on earth would God put me through that test? Second option would be request for clarification and guidance. And I have to be honest, this would most likely be mine. My response, you sure? So this would be initial confusion and doubt. Upon receiving God's command to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham would have been initially confused and filled with doubt. He might have questioned the clarity and purpose of the command as it goes against established ethical and moral norms, right? That's not like a tradition. That's not a moral thing to kill your child. He might have sought communication with God. Instead of immediately preparing for the sacrifice, Abraham would seek a deeper understanding of God's will. He might engage in prayer, meditation, or other forms of seeking divine guidance. His prayers would express his inner turmoil and his desire for God to clarify the command. In other words, he'd be saying, are you sure? Are you sure? Did I misunderstand? Is this a metaphor, God? Do I take this literally? Was that just my imagination? Was that my mind playing tricks on me? And this might have led to a dialogue with God. In response to Abraham's prayer, God might engage possibly in a dialogue with him. God could provide additional insight into the purpose behind the command, reaffirm the divine nature of the request, and offer reassurance of his presence and guidance. And maybe that would lead to alternative paths. Maybe you just said, the important is your faith, and it's not actually about the sacrifice. I just wanted you to learn a lesson of faith. But would that account be written in our Bibles if that's how he responded? No, because this is extraordinary, which is why it's in here. So this would lead to Abraham's compliance with understanding. So he's like, okay, now I understand God. Now I'm going to obey. Once it makes sense in my mind, then the obedience will follow. Yet that's not what happened. Another option, appeal for mercy and forgiveness. This would be how he would respond to that divine command, initial distress and sorrow. So getting God's command to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham would have been deeply distressed and filled with sorrow. He might have felt torn between his love for his son and devotion to God. It would lead to prayer and pleading. Rather than immediately preparing for the sacrifice, he would have fallen to his knees in prayer and pleaded with God for mercy and forgiveness. He would tell God just how much he loves Isaac and he doesn't want to kill his own son. This might lead to confession and submission. In his prayer, Abraham might confess his inability to comprehend the purpose behind God's command. He might submit himself to God's will, but plead for an alternative resolution that would spare Isaac's life, right? Like, God, please not this. I'll do it if you're really going to put my arm behind my back, I'll do it, but please give me a different way. Or what about this option? resolute refusal with fear and trembling. So again, he gets the command. Upon receiving God's command to sacrifice Isaac, he would have been gripped by profound fear and trembling. He would recognize the weight of the command and its moral and ethical implications. This would lead to inner struggle. Abraham's fear and trembling would intensify as he grappled with the conflict between his deep devotion to God and his ethical duty to protect the life of his innocent son. He might experience that inner turmoil. Prayer and appeal. Abraham would fall to his knees in prayer and appeal to God. His prayer would express his unwavering devotion and loyalty to God, but also his inability to carry out an act that he considers morally and ethically wrong. In other words, he'd pray, God, I obey you, I love you, but I can't do this. I can't kill my kid. How many of us would respond that way, being honest? And this would lead to a resolute refusal. In his prayer, Abraham would resolutely refuse to follow God's command to sacrifice Isaac. He might firmly state that he cannot commit such an act, emphasizing his commitment to ethical principles and the sanctity of human life. Because those things are good, right? Protecting life, protecting innocence, those are good things. And yet God's moral command is contradicting ethics and rationality. Acceptance of consequences. Abraham would be fully aware of the potential consequences of his refusal, including God's displeasure or punishment. However, his refusal would be unwavering, born out of a deep moral conviction. He could have stood his ground. This is immoral. I'm not doing it. Has any of God's command ever seemed harsh or immoral to you, or cruel to you, for being honest? Finally, a delayed or stalled response, right? That would also be a lot of us, right? Initial shock and confusion. So he'd get the command. He would have been in a state of shock, confusion. He might have not even process it, right? Just, what? Yeah. And then gone away just thinking for a couple days, what on earth was that about? Why on earth would he say that? Stalled action. Instead of immediately preparing for the sacrifice like he did. Remember, he put his affairs in order early the next morning. He was on his way. But in this case, he wouldn't do that. He would have stalled, delayed taking any action. He could have been caught between that loyalty of God or the love for my son. This would be, again, an inner struggle. During this delay, Abraham would experience a profound inner struggle. His fear and trembling would intensify as he wrestled with the moral and ethical implications of the command, right? Can you imagine that? What do? I need more time. I need more time. Do I kill my son or do I not kill my son? What's the best decision? That could have paralyzed you. Don't you think you'd be paralyzed in that situation? What am I supposed to do with this? And this would be prayer and seeking guidance. He might engage in prayer and meditation, seeking guidance and clarity from God. His prayers would reflect his inner turmoil and his desire for God to provide a resolution to the ethical conflict. Right? All those are, the last ones are most of them are pretty noble responses, don't you think? Like full obedience with fear and trembling, where he still did it. Or, maybe praying for a different way, but still doing it. Those are all noble things. But none of these options are what Abraham chose to do. Not even the first one. It's something different. He fully obeyed with fear and trembling with another key ingredient that all the other options were missing, including the first one. And that's faith. See, in all those options, there's one key ingredient missing from it, and that is faith. And here's what I mean. Hebrews 11:1. I love when the Bible gives you definitions for Bible words. Absolutely, that's the best. So here's our definition for faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The substance of faith is assurance in the unknown, right? And Abraham was in no man's land, right? He was beyond reason. He was beyond ethics. He was beyond his own understanding. He was beyond his own morality. He was beyond his own love for his child. He transcended all those things because of what his hope was. And this means that you are sure when there's no proof you should be. He was sure when he had no evidence that it was going to play any other way out than him killing his son. Right? He had no assurance of that. Yet he did because of his faith. And this is what the Hebrew writer tells us in verse 17. By faith, by that assurance of things hoped for, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. he considered, notice that assurance of things hoped for, he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. He received Isaac back with more joy than he had previously, right? Because it's like he got his son back from the dead. And again, resurrection wasn't like a thing. You understand? Like Abraham hadn't seen someone raised from the dead. So this is absolutely absurd. His faith that his son would be raised from the dead or something like that is absurd. There's no logical reason to think that. There's no proof to think that. Yet he knew God's promises. He knew what God was going to do. And so he was able to make that movement of faith, but make a double movement. Abraham was a knight of faith. He was able to unquestioningly, immediately, and with no communication to Sarah or to his son, he didn't communicate that. He just obeyed God's terrible command. And what I mean by terrible is, for him, that's a terrible command, right? To kill your own child. But why? It's because he trusted in the goodness and the trustworthiness of God. He didn't know how. He only knew if he did what God commanded, God would work it out for the best. Abraham was able to forget about reason, ethics, and even his love for his own child in the trust that God would work all things for good. So there's two options. There's obedience with fear and trembling and faith in fear and trembling. They make identical movements, right? Because they both entail obedience, right? They both obey. But what makes faith in fear and trembling different from obedience in fear and trembling is what he did and what he expected. In other words, Abraham could have thought, all right, I'm sacrificing my son. I guess God's promises are nixed, and I'm going to have to kill my son, and I'm going to have to live with that for the rest of my life. And just be extremely bitter, go up on that mountain with no hope, robbed of all joy for the rest of his life because of what God commanded him to do. But we don't get that indication from Abraham. He obeys God, and why it's faith is because he knew he wasn't going into it bitterly. He went into it with fear and trembling, absolutely, but he knew that what was going to happen was going to be better than he could possibly imagine. That somehow, some way, God's going to give what he promised, even though he's about to do something that contradicts all of it in his mind, because he knows who God is, because he has that relationship with God. Abraham is commendable for three reasons. Who he loved most. Who's that? God. More than his own son. He loved God the most. What he expected was the impossible, the absurd. And who he strove with was not the world, not anything else, just with God. And remember, Israel means wrestles with God. And we're still called, we are Israel. We are Israel because you wrestle with who you love. Right? You strive, and that's not like, again, Hebrew writer tells us, don't fight so that you get your hip put out of joint. But it's a recognizing that in following God, there are going to be challenges to us. There are going to be things that are striving for us because we're still in the flesh. And so sometimes God's laws seem like death to us, but they bring life. There's no room for human calculation in the equation of faith. And that's absolutely true. You cannot think. I worry that so many times in my life, and I feel like the lives of others around us, we're in that cruise control, and we don't really think of, all right, maybe you're obedient. Okay, maybe you're obedient in every aspect. That's great. But is there faith in that obedience? Are you obeying with fear and trembling out of punishment, or you are obeying because you have faith that what God is going to give you is realer than what you know, what you can reason, what you think is moral, all your senses, your conscience? God is beyond all those things. God is the highest. He transcends all forms of our thinking and logic, and that's why God tells us. That's why Abraham is this knight of faith. We have this example because it's obedience with an expectation. It's not just obedience. It's we obey because we know what God will do, even when it seems impossible. Faith includes obedience, but that's just a part of the whole. Faith is obedience with the unyielding assurance of the good that will come of it. So what about us? I hope no one comes next Sunday morning and says, I killed my son because God told me to, right? No. But what about us? Are any commands of God burdening to you? And I don't mean, maybe you don't have a bad attitude about it, but maybe it's just really hard. Maybe it's a specific trial. Maybe it's a specific temptation. Maybe it's a specific situation. Maybe it's tragedy. Maybe it's grief that you've gone through, and you just wonder, How do I keep following God in this? How do I keep obedient? How do I overcome this? Paul tells us in Romans 8:28, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Do you believe that? You believe that? Everything, even the worst memories you have, the worst things that have happened to you, do you believe that that is going to work out for the best because of what God's going to do with it? How do we view God's commands? As burdens or as opportunities to receive a blessing, right? It's the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. We have no proof, tangible evidence of why it's better to obey God here than later, right? The dead haven't come back and talked to us, right? We don't know. But we know by faith because we have that assurance. In 1 John 5:3, I love this. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. For everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. To overcome the world, that means we transcend everything. We transcend everything that this broken world can throw at us. It means we overcome all trials, temptations, and consider who we love the most and what we expect and who we strive with. Because if you truly have faith in God, no man, demon, or devil can take that from you. There's nothing, no force on earth or in hell that can remove that confidence. You're untouchable. If you have faith like Abraham, nothing can get to you. You're invincible, in other words, because it's just like the communication. Why didn't Abraham communicate with Isaac or with his wife Sarah? Well, I doubt they'd understand because this was him and God. He knew this faith was no one else was incorporated in that. The faith was solely between him and God. And sometimes, yes, it's important that we bear one another's burdens, that we look out for one another, that we love one another, that we serve each other. But we must all realize that in our lives, you on your own have to make decisions that exhibit faith. You have to follow that challenge. You have to follow that challenging command. You have to get through that trying time in your life because you know God's going to do something with this that's better than I could possibly imagine. Because imagine if you don't have faith, it makes it a lot harder to obey, right? Because if you're just obeying, not thinking that you're actually going to be rewarded for it, or what God's going to give you is better than what you could have now, that's going to make your obedience do this, right? Because you have no faith, you have no reason, you have no incentive to follow God. But God gives us his promises. In 1 John 5:5, he concludes with this: who is it that overcomes the world except the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? The only way to transcend tragedy, death, sorrow, temptation, evil is by having complete faith in Jesus Christ. Now remember, a saving faith is an obedient faith. They go hand in hand. It's not just obedience. It's not just this intellectual. True faith is one that demands action, but it demands an expectation that even when it's absurd, it's possible with God because all things are possible with him. Jesus says in Matthew 13:45, this will be the last verse, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. Why? Because the pearl was more valuable than anything he had. And if there's anything off limits in our walk with God, God, don't touch that. God, I'm not giving that up. God, I need this. If there's any aspect of your life, and I heard this example by this preacher. He was talking about a couple teenagers were talking about music, and he was like, I can't believe you listen to that type of music. And the preacher walked over there and he said, is it wrong to listen to this type of music? And he said, well, I don't really care. It doesn't matter. And he said, all right, it's not even about the music now. It's the fact that you have a thing that's off limits to you for God. That's the problem. You won't let God change that. You won't change for God in that area. And honestly, and this is one of the disadvantages of not being able to read minds, I don't know what you all are going through. I don't know what you've been through. I know some things. I see bits and pieces. But I know all of us have some challenge, some command by God that is difficult for us to keep and to follow. And if there's nothing that is difficult for you, then that's a problem. that's a problem, because there has to be that element of fear and trembling in our Christian walk. And that shouldn't be a scary thing when we're abiding in God's grace, when we're abiding in his love. That's not, I'm not saved. It's not about that. It's about analyzing, when in my life have I actually made acts of faith? Things that risked it all, that went beyond reason, that went beyond what I thought was right or wrong, that went beyond love over my child or over my family, that God is above all else. How much on a day-to-day basis do we actually exhibit faith? Like Abraham. I don't mean, I believe in God. That kind of faith. The faith that can make you do something that seems so morally reprehensible, yet know that God's going to do something about it. He's going to make it even better. This story is beyond amazing. It's difficult for us, and it always, without a doubt, usually spawns questions in your mind, like how could you do that? Abraham must have not loved his child very much if he's willing to sacrifice it. It's like, no, you don't understand. It's a faith that transcends all else. And how you exhibit that faith is by believing that Jesus is the Son of God. You believe in what he commanded his apostles to teach, that he told them to go out and baptize everyone in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to repent, right, and become a child of God. You change your old ways and you decide, I'm giving over my life to Christ. He rules over everything, and you're washed in the water for forgiveness of sins. If you have any need, we ask that you please come forward as we stand and sing.